with athletes at the college level where it's like, okay, they're in season. This is a star athlete. Their knees bugging them. We can make modifications to the strength program to work around it. They don't need to squat to full depth. They're still going to be a great athlete of their sport, like whether or not they're squatting to full depth. So we'll go to we'll squat to a box or something like that, prevent that pain, still getting lower body movement, and they're good. Versus when it's off season, it's like, okay, you're getting knee pain. Let's take our time now, since we have time and you don't have to be competing, like you're not going to all these games and traveling. Let's take time to find the culprit of that. Like, is it a mobility thing? Did you have an injury where you fell or something like that? Like, let's find that. And then now let's address it and put those parameters, accessory work or whatever into the program and get you better so that when in season rolls around, that knee pain is gone.
The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. We offer coaching and individualized program design, as well as educational content for coaches and athletes. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. I don't normally talk this much in a day.
This is a lot of talking for us.
Definitely for me. It's like if I'm not like coaching or like in a meeting,
I'm not talking.
Yeah.
I'm not talking either. I know, like, I would have, in college, I had a few internships in, like, California, and I just went out and lived in California on my own, and it was wild because, like, I would go days, and I'd be like, wow, I haven't actually spoken. Like, I haven't used my voice. This is great.
Talk to somebody who's, sorry, I'm out of practice here.
But, yeah, like, I think that's why me and my sister get along really well, because, like, she's outgoing, talks a lot and all that. And, like, that's basically our relationship is she carries a conversation and I just follow along.
Yeah.
And it's great.
I could just picture when you were saying the other podcast, like, you were just, like, watching all the other kids and you're, like, observing them as a kid.
Yeah.
It's like, now you do the same thing. It's just you get paid for it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's shit squat form.
You can just say it out loud and then they know. All right, well, today we want to talk about navigating knee injuries because both of us in the last year have had knee injuries, which is obviously not what you want, but sometimes you get handed that. And I mean, I think anybody who's in athletics, especially if you're like really pushing yourself long enough, you will be injured, regardless of how good you move, regardless of how educated your coach is, regardless of all the other factors. Like, it's just going to happen because it's like part of life at times. And that's not a cop out to say that like you shouldn't like really try to do things to avoid it, but it will happen. I don't know if we needed that disclaimer, but I feel like sometimes that's helpful. Just a reminder for people. Yeah,
for sure. And like injuries don't have to be like debilitating back pain where you can't even stand up or get up and walk. Like it could be something like, oh, your elbows kind of naggy pain, things like that. Like it happens, repetitive movement. It's just how the body is.
Yeah, and Chris always says this. He's like, here's the line. We're going to ride this line. And sometimes we're going to overshoot it a little bit. If we overshoot it, we're going to be doing injuries and problems. I'll have to like pull up Chris's clip. But it's good. I mean, I think that's like a good conversation that you should have with athletes or that you should have with yourself as an athlete is like, hey, I'm pushing myself really hard and like I'm going to do everything I can to stay just below that threshold, but sometimes you will spill over.
Yeah.
And ideally you'd have all the information in the world where you know exactly where you're at all times. But the reality is like you're blind to knowing how close you are to that line at times. And there's other times where just like you might have just an acute injury. Like there's like chronic stuff that will pop up. Like, oh man, I've been doing, I've tripled my rope climb volume this cycle and like my elbows are cranky from it. It's like, okay, that makes sense. Okay, let's back off a little bit and you'll probably be fine.
Yeah.
Whereas the other stuff where like, you did something and you had this moment where it's like, okay, this is the injury and it happened right then. Tissue was overloaded, couldn't handle it, you got injured. So let's go through both of ours. I'll let you go first. Just kind of like explain what happened and then maybe like what the first couple days like were like after the injury.
Yeah, so for me it was more of an injury that was caused by an accident, right? So like I fell off a burpee box jump over. It happens for me a lot. Like, I'm not a graceful person. And this time I thought I like nailed it because I like kind of somersaulted out of it, and I was like, nailed it. Like, I'm fine.
Yeah.
I'm so athletic, whatever. And then like I was fine that day, and then it was towards the nighttime where like it started like swelling up a bit, and I was like, okay, this is kind of bothering me a bit. And I'm like, well, I fell today, so it's probably related to that, right? And then throughout the next days, especially like when I would wake up in the morning, my knee, like the range of motion was compromised. It was like really painful to like bend my knee, go into any knee flexion. That was super annoying, and it was painful to like move and even step on it. So I was like walking, looking like I had like a peg leg or something. So that wasn't fun. So I kind of had an idea what it was, but I went to my friend Abby, who's a physical therapist, and she checked it out, and she was like, "Yeah."
How many days after was this?
This was probably like, I want to say 5 to 7 days after. Yeah, I went because I was like, all right, this is kind of bugging me. It's not going away. So went to see her, and she was like, okay, this is probably it. She did her thing and all that stuff, gave me my prescription of exercises and what I should be doing. But basically, the way I went about it was like an acute injury, right? So it was just had to give it time to heal, right? It's one of those things that just needs time, and usually that takes about 4 to 6 weeks for those type of things, for like a small meniscus tear. So knowing that, I was like, okay, I know it's going to get better if I don't make it worse. Right? If I don't start deep squatting and doing these things that cause pain. So I used pain as like my like a threshold type thing. Like if after I reach a certain level of pain, I'm like, all right, I'm going to back off because that's not feeling too good. So during that time, those 4 to 6 weeks, I would squat to, I put like a D ball on a plate, right? So just like squat, not to full depth. And I did that for like my lower body days just to get range of movement, to work on some type of strength for my lower body. And that worked fine. Like it didn't hurt or anything. And then eventually over time, just kept lowering the depth of my squat, and within like 5 weeks I was completely back to normal.
That's good. I think your process is pretty close to ideal, to be honest. Where it's like I don't necessarily think that, again, unless you have somebody who is a close friend like Abby to you, where it's like she's not gonna like freak out and like take all your stuff away from you if she doesn't think that's not appropriate.
Right.
Because there's the concern that I have for a lot of my remote athletes is that like they go to somebody and the person doesn't understand what they're doing as an athlete and doesn't understand the demands of their sport, or just has their own opinions of what CrossFit is and like what that type of training is, or weightlifting or anything else. And they just assume that you should just stop all of that because they don't. And in the defense of a physician like that, or a PT like that, it's like they're just probably trying to keep the person from injuring themselves worse.
Right.
And like there's plenty of people out there who aren't educated at all, who it's like, okay, yeah, it's not ideal for them to just stop moving altogether or stop their sport altogether. However, that might be better than someone who's completely misinformed, because I know people who've done this where it's like, oh yeah, like I just, it didn't feel great, so I injured it kind of a couple days before, and I just kept plowing through, and then I was like, oh, I really messed it up then. And it's like, yeah, what were you doing? So in their defense, there's definitely some of that goes on. But for me, what happened was I was in competition prep for Metcon Rush, which was like end of August. And so this was like, I think basically the right to like the tail end of like my first prep cycle for that. And then I was going to like do a quick deload and switch over to like full comp prep, because it was like 4 weeks out or something, 5 weeks out. And I was doing like repeat Burpee box get overs and thrusters. It was like 963 of a Burpee box get over to like 40 inches or like 48 inches. And like 15, 12, 9 thruster 115 or something like that. My last set, and it was like, I did like 15 minutes of rest in between. So it was like very high power output, like long rest. And I've had done multiple cycles of like front squats and things. So like my legs were plenty strong and like my joints felt fine. So it wasn't like I had like these really like red flags going into it. And one of my last set of thrusters on my set of 3, I was coming down and like right at the bottom of the squat, just like sounded like someone put like a pork rind behind my knee. It was just like at the bottom. I was like, that's not good. So it's just like, for me at the time, I finished out my interval, of course, and like was stretching and stuff at the end. It was just like not feeling real great, and I was like, yes, probably did something to it. Hopefully, it's just like a tweak or something where it's just like didn't sound good and it wasn't like something catastrophic, or like something super concerning. And then it was just like over the next couple of days, just kind of got worse and worse, where like to the point where I could barely row. Oh, wow. So like that amount of knee flexion, like even getting close to like 90 degrees was like really not doable.
Yeah.
So, and obviously like that's not an eccentric environment at all. So like box step ups weren't great. And usually like those are fine for people with knee pain. So it was like not very good at all. And I was like, well, I'm not going to not compete because I think I can still like work my way around this. And so I just kind of like was smart about things. Like didn't really push it. And like modified a little bit how I was squatting, where I would take like a little bit of a wider stance and like try to use like a little bit more of like hip tension versus like that knee, like really deep knee flexion when I was squatting. So I did modify my squat a bit, but I tried to keep it still like symmetrical as I was able to do. And of course in the competition, there was like a 1RM clean ladder and I PR'd my clean at the end of it. So, and, yeah, I would definitely wore 2 pairs of knee sleeves for that ladder, but no one caught me, so here I am. But yeah, it was all things considered, it held up, but it was after that competition, so it went like a full maybe 6 weeks before I saw anybody for it. And Alicia here at the gym is a physical therapist, doctor of physical therapy. I just kind of like had a conversation with her at that point. I was like, hey, this is what happened. This is like my symptoms. And she's like, yeah, it was probably cartilage, which I think that's probably true. So at that point, it was definitely seeing improvement. But at the same time, it was like I needed to do a little bit more time off and stuff like that. But that was like appropriate at that time. And it was like, I think one of the things as like a competitive athlete, you have to make a decision on is like, is this worth it to me to like take the risk to still compete? I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to that because there's some people who are going to be way more tolerant and you might have like lasting things that like really push way longer past your competition than they would have if you just didn't do it. And there's other times where like people are like, yeah, that's just not worth it. Like I tore my meniscus right at the tail end of my wrestling career and it kept catching and like locking up on me all the time. I was like, yes, it just isn't worth it. Like I was a very average wrestler. So I was like, I'm not going to the NCAA tournament. So like, I'm just going to pack in my career. Which isn't an easy decision, but I think it just shows like how much like something's worth it to you. Yeah.
And that's, I know I spoke about it yesterday during our lunch and learn where it was like, it depends on what type of time of the season and like what your goals are and all that. And so like you with Metcon Rush, it's like you were like, all right, I could probably do it. I just have to be smart about it leading up to it. You already had that set. And it was a good competition for you. And it's a big one, right? On the East Coast, like Metcon Rush.
Yeah, it's pretty well known.
Yeah. So it's like, there's that too. And, I'm sure it helped the business and all that, Zor's name and all just being there and competing well. So it's like, all right, I could be smart leading up to it. But if it was like a little small local competition and you knew the workouts beforehand and there was going to be a ton of squatting and knee flexion and it really wasn't going to benefit you at all whether or not you did this, it's like, all right, don't be dumb. Yeah. Right. And I know we have that conversation with athletes at the college level where it's like, okay, they're in season. This is a star athlete. Their knees bugging them. We can make modifications to the strength program to work around it. They don't need to squat to full depth. They're still going to be a great athlete of their sport, like whether or not they're squatting to full depth. So we'll squat to a box or something like that, prevent that pain, still getting lower body movement, and they're good. Versus when it's off season, it's like, okay, you're getting knee pain. Let's take our time now since we have time and you don't have to be competing, like you're not going to all these games and traveling. Let's take time to find the culprit of that. Like, is it a mobility thing? Did you have an injury where you fell or something like that? Like, let's find that. And then now let's address it and put those parameters, accessory work or whatever into the program and get you better so that when in season rolls around, that knee pain is gone.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think obviously like our injuries weren't the same, but the fact that like you were in a place where you could basically just like pull out all the stuff that bothered it right away and do a much more like traditionally appropriate, like what you know, the recommended steps to like your recovery process. And like, again, not that it was 1-to-1, like not that our injuries were the same, but like the fact that you were able to do that shows that like you were basically back to pretty full strength within like 6 weeks.
Right.
So it was like your time to recovery was a whole lot quicker than mine, which just shows like, yeah, I mean, if you can do that, obviously like that's, and you want to do that, that's probably the way to go.
Yeah. And I know for me too, like I also do have nagging like injury on my other knee. And that one's more chronic where it comes over time. And it's like some days I'm squatting, I'm like, this kind of feels like crap. And for me, that's like, and I know before I started running more often, I was like, I need to address this before I
Just start hammering away.
Yeah, before I start like running like multiple times a week and all that. So that's where I started adding in things like as a preventative measure is continuing my strength training, but also add in like a lot of isometric work at certain knee angles and all that stuff for my knees, like iso lunge holds, all that stuff, and kind of help with that. And also address some mobility issues because I have very tight hamstrings, which also lead to some pain in my knees. So addressing those two things, knowing that those were my issues there, so that I could prepare myself for when the load increased on running and I was having so much impact.
Yeah, almost like using like your injury as like a learning experience. Like these are the ways that I can probably adjust things going forward. And it's like not only just not be injured, but to keep my joints feeling better.
Yeah. And I think that's like, there's low hanging fruits, right? Like isometrics and all that for whatever joint is nagging you is an awesome way to strengthen those tendons and all that and get you prepared. And that's something that like I do a lot with athletes, knowing that like, oh, hey, there's this constant repetitive movement. Let's get stronger in this position and, you know, get those tendons nice and happy before we start hammering away and putting that load on it.
Yeah. Yeah, I've definitely incorporated some isometrics and it's just like additional hamstring work because, again, in CrossFit, you get so much quad no matter what you do that it's like you just need to put some time and attention on your hamstrings. Otherwise, it's just not going to be balanced. And the stronger your hamstrings are, it's just easier to keep your joint centration a little bit better. Besides the fact that like you'll just probably move more appropriately. Yeah. So like for me, I've done a lot more, and I've probably incorporated this into a few more athletes programs as well. It's just like, you know, deadlifts with a controlled eccentric, you know, glute ham raises, hamstring curls or like banded hamstring curls. And then for like myself personally, I've done some like isometric hamstring work. And one of the things that was kind of interesting was that this knee, actually, I've had 40 surgeries on it all before, like by the time I graduated high school.
Are you serious? 4?
Yeah, 4.
Dang.
Yeah, and so
before
like
high school, before graduating high school?
College.
College?
Yeah.
Even that, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And generally it's like good. Like actually like my other one like is more cranky today sometimes than like the one I've had all those surgeries on. But yeah, it was like initially I had an ACL tear from like an acute injury in high school, and then just kind of like some additional. The good thing was like my meniscus was pretty intact, so but I've had some meniscal tears since then, just like fraying and other stuff that I just got cleaned up, and for each of them I had them largely repaired versus removed, like mastectomy. So I have a little bit more cartilage there or padding there than some other people who get that procedure. Yeah. So that's good, but at the same time, it's like a longer recovery process, which isn't great, obviously. But for me, just doing a little bit of extra hamstring work on that side. My point being, like when I got my my ACL reconstructed, they took part of my hamstring tendon out, so my knee flexion ability, especially past 90 degrees on that leg, is way worse than the other one. Yeah. And like if you like watch me do like deadlifts or something and you look at the back of my knee, it looks like all like mangled and weird.
Really?
Yeah. So like I'm definitely like missing part of my hamstring there. I mean, they took it out, so clearly it is. But to do a little bit of like of that like end range of motion, like really trying to like drive a lot of tension there to like work on like that I always forget if it's like pails or rails. One of those. So like the end range, working on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's been helpful for me just because like I clearly lack range of motion there. And there's like certain joints where like that's the case, like in other areas too. Like I'm always going to be working on shoulder extension as someone who just sits on a laptop all day.
Yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything else that like you've adjusted, whether it's like knee based or not, from like other injuries?
Yeah. I get nagging shoulder pains as well. And so doing a lot of shoulder extension work and all that, focusing on that. I always do that. Like, I superset it with like my upper body exercises. So if I'm like benching or something like that, I'll do like some YTWLs, crossover symmetry, just in between, just to kind of open it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Looking more at my pull to push ratios, right? So that's something that
Can't just bench every day, Dave.
Yeah, I know. If I could, I would. Only 3 times a week. I limit myself. So, paying a little bit more attention to that volume and making sure that ratio is somewhat looking okay, versus just doing all push, right? So that's another one. Yeah, those are the main things there. And also working in different planes of motion. That's one thing. I think CrossFit especially is very sagittal plane. And so working on things
Phone booth fitness.
Huh?
Phone booth fitness.
Yeah. It's just looking at doing things a little bit more like side to side rotational and all that, just to create some type of balance there. I've noticed a lot of weaknesses like glute med and all that. So addressing all those things just to create a little bit more balance in my body and performance. And I do that a lot for athletes too. They'll notice that there's some, like in the accessory part of it, I'll put like frontal work, rotational work.
Yeah. Those are like, there's certain things that like I just try to incorporate. Like the accessory work ends up being like just like a lot of stuff that people don't see in the sport for my CrossFit athletes. Obviously like weightlifting is very limited because, you get 2 movements. So it's like you try to, vary the patterns as much as you can because people are already so repetitive in their sport. Even CrossFit is repetitive for people because they're going through progressions that are doing the same thing week over week to get them better at that thing. But then it's like you need to start incorporating those other things to make sure that they're healthy. But then the volume of everything just keeps creeping up. So you have to be careful of that too. But like to your point, like I think doing some like single leg stuff, a little bit of extra hamstring and glute work. So like making sure in this case, like if it's as simple as like either doing some like split squats or like Bulgarians or getting like lunges into like intervals and other things, if it's more of an off season mode where they're not doing a ton of like metcons, it's been helpful. And then doing other things that like, for example, like if I think about if I have an athlete who's dealing with like cranky shoulders or elbows or things from like doing this like a ton of pressing and pulling work, especially like kipping stuff that you see like closer to a season, if they're coming off like a competition, it's like, let's just take away some of your kipping work for now and just give you a lot more strict stuff, a lot more controlled range of motion where you're having to like, you're not just like bouncing off the end range and like relying on your joints a lot, which is a good quality to have as an athlete who's trying to be like as efficient as you can and least amount of metabolically expensive to do something, but not a great way from like a joint health perspective all the time. So just like pulling people back in their off season a little bit more and like, okay, this might not be specific anymore. And that's where like the most specific, but it's still going to lend itself to keeping you healthy and to like push like the foundation forward where when we start to rebuild onto like for your next season, that you'll be in a much better place.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, I know like you were talking about, PTs before where you were mentioning that like Alicia is good with understanding the CrossFit side of things and Abby's like that as well. And having like, I think like I know there's like, she talks to me about it all the time where it's like, there's a lot of PTs out there that are very old school and don't understand the athletes and strength side of things and sports or whatever, like especially CrossFit. So they try to like, oh, hey, take that away and all that stuff. But yeah, like one thing that I've noticed with, like, I follow a few PTs on Instagram, right? And sometimes they have good information. Sometimes it's like, all right, I would never apply this. Just like anything, right?
Yeah.
And there's one PT who's really a proponent of like strength training and all that. And one of his things is a lot of times when you're feeling a nagging injury, like a lot of times the solution is like give it rest, right? Some people always try to like come up with all these fancy interventions and all that stuff, and a lot of times it's like give it rest. And I know I had like a elbow, like my elbow was bothering me one time, my medial, when we were working together. And it was because I was doing a lot of rope climbs and like kipping and all this stuff. And I talked to you. I also talked to Abby, and that was like the feedback from both of you guys. It's like, yeah, you're doing a lot of gripping. Give it rest, right? And so it's like you could still do things and work around it and all that, work on other things and this and that, but we're probably going to have to take volume down. That was the, I talked to you, and then I remember you were like, oh, yeah, also check Abby's, like what she would say from her side of things. And that was her recommendation too. We just went around that and it worked out fine. And then guess what? Within 3 weeks, my elbow was fine.
Yeah. And that's the thing is like, obviously you can't be like too timid, especially depends on what time of year you're in, right? If you were coming up on competition, we knew you had rope climbs in it. Okay, we're not just going to take them all away because it's like you're just going to decondition that really quickly. But we're also not going to try to keep pushing it because then it's like you could make it way worse. And like now you're in not a good place when you actually go to do your competition. So it's like there's also, again, if you're working with competitive athletes, there's these constraints of like your timing for like your ideal timing for getting back to recovery for your injury is not going to, it will never align perfectly with your season. So like for myself right now, I'm like dealing with a shoulder. I probably tore my labrum to a degree. And I've been rehabbing that since I've gotten back from Texas at TFX. And it's ideally I would have like another two months at least to rehab it before I had to compete. And I don't. So I got like 2 weeks before I'm going to have to like actually put everything back in. And I've been rehabbing it since, the end of January. So it's definitely progressed a lot. And if I think it's really stupid for me to compete, I won't. But at the same time, I like want to be prepared. So like, I'm like being as aggressive as I can while still trying to be intelligent about my training. So like there are times too where like, hopefully again, you have somebody to like at least bounce the ideas off of like, is this stupid for me to do this? And like have somebody that you trust that you can go to for that, even if it's just like a coach or a physical therapist or someone who can, be objective about your training besides just you, to be able to like, this amount of pain is tolerable. Like this is what you should be thinking about. Okay. Try to limit, if this movement, if you're, above a 3 out of 10 pain the next day or 48 hours later, things like that. So I think, if you can get somebody where you can trust them and like you're in that situation, ideally a physical therapist, because that's where, that's their scope, then I think that's probably best.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I feel like I'm really lucky that I have Abby around and ask her questions and everything. Remember I like how I started this podcast with like, I don't think I had many injuries. And now I'm like listing them off. I'm like, both knees, my elbows, my shoulders cranky. Now I'm going to bring up my low back.
If you've been training for like a decade or more, like you're going to have some stuff.
Yeah. But I remember now I'm going to talk about my low back. I injured my low back and I don't remember what it was or like, I just remember I competed and then I was an idiot. And a few days later, I'm like, I'm going to do heavy back squats. Like literally 2 days. Like I competed on a Saturday, Monday. I'm like, I'm going to like try a 1 rep max. Like that dumb, right? And like.
But you would have looked like a genius if you would have PR'd your back
squat.
Oh
yeah, I know. I would have been a genius. But so my squat, I think I did hit that 1 rep max. But then I went and did after I was like, oh man, this is great. Like whatever. My body's great. And I went and did Bulgarian split squats heavy. And I know I have tight hips and all this stuff, especially from competing. I don't know what it was. Like, as I'm coming up, like something happened in my back and I just like fell down. I was like, oh my God, I can't get back up. And luckily like my phone was next to me and I just like speed dialed Abby. And I was like, Abby, I'm on the floor. Like, what do I do?
What do you even do with that call?
And she was just like, all right, try.
I'm not a paramedic.
Yeah, I know. I was like, but I treat her like one. But yeah, so she kind of like walked me through everything and I was just like, man, like how lucky I was like that I had someone who like knows what they're doing and like helps me through it like as it happened. Because if not, I would just like laid there on the floor until like hours later where I could like feel okay to stand up.
Yeah, so I guess maybe I don't know where people can go to find like reliable PTs. Maybe we can revisit that down the road because we've got some stuff in the works. But Yeah, I think even, again, just having somebody that you can go to who's educated, who's outside of yourself, I think is probably the biggest thing. Again, ideally somebody who's a professional. But yeah, I mean, I think again, as you're like maybe initially assessing an injury, I would, even if you're not going to professional yet, I would just give yourself a little bit of time to like truly let everything settle in and like see like, okay, like how bad is this actually? And don't like mask it with like pain meds or anything like that. Just like try to figure out like, okay, where's my baseline at after, 72 hours or something, right? Like, I had an athlete who just kind of like injured themselves and we didn't think it was that serious. This was yesterday actually. And I was like, okay, why don't you just like ride the bike a little bit? Like 10 minutes on the bike erg, because it was like, something that wouldn't affect it. It was more upper body related. And, I was like, okay. And then at that point, if you want to do any like pushing and pulling work, that's like, no shear on your back, go ahead and do that. And then, just like, let me know how you're feeling tomorrow. And then, we'll talk to them today. And I was like, okay, let me know again tomorrow. And then we'll keep adjusting things as we need to. Because like oftentimes people like have all this adrenaline when they first get an injury, and it's like really easy to just like plow through or to just like completely stop everything you're doing. Where it's like, okay, just be smart, take a second, figure out what like your best steps are, and then ideally if you have somebody that you can go to, like go to them.
Yeah, definitely. I do think that's a good recommendation. Like, don't panic at first. Kind of rest and adjust, and just be reasonable about it, because it could go either way. You're like you mentioned, like you're gonna plow through it and you're gonna be like, no, I got it, and then it's gonna make it worse, or you're just gonna eliminate everything,
right?
And then just kind of like
completely detrain yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And that was one of the things that it sounded like you did really well in your recovery process, was you didn't just like take out squats completely. Like, oh, my knee hurts, I'm just not gonna squat for the next 6 weeks. I was like, okay, what can I do where I can still load this pattern without pain and try to keep things symmetrical, where the pattern isn't gonna like really ingrain something that's like just awful, and super like asymmetrical. So, what can you do that is going to allow for that, and then slowly continue to build tolerance in the movement that you actually want to do again? Because it's not like you just don't want to squat for the rest of your life. So it's like, okay, let's do what we can with this movement without bringing a lot of irritation and more pain along with that, or stuff that would potentially set you back.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many variables you can manipulate, right? There's like, for example, the squat, like there's the depth, there's the stance, whether it's axial loaded or whatever. There's like the angles of the feet. Like you could like manipulate all these different things. And it's the same thing with like upper body press. And like if you're benching, like again, the width of the grip, if you have like a football bar where you could have like a different angle of that, like the angle of the bench, like there are all these like the load, the volume, there's all these variables.
So many factors.
Yeah, so many factors. And you just have to be able to kind of adjust and see what works for you and work at a tolerable level.
Yeah, I think there's a couple things, but I think if you have a coach that has just been around for a while, they're, by the nature of sport, like gonna have plenty of athletes who've gone through injuries that have been similar to yours, even if it's not the exact same thing, where they at least can conceptualize like, okay, you've got rope climb elbow pain. It's like, it's the worst during legless. Okay, it's probably just because you're yanking on that tendon the whole time. It's like, okay, let's do an extended cyclical warm-up because you're coming up on competition in 2 weeks. We're not going to take all your rope climb volume away. We're going to move some of it towards a hand-over-hand sled pull, because like there's that really not much of an eccentric catch at all. Should really limit the amount of tendon irritation you're getting, but getting enough blood flow into the muscles and keeping that tissue tolerance where when you actually are asked to go out on the floor and do it, you'll be capable of it. And then let's add some other like variations of like a bicep curl where like your hands in a different position where, okay, we don't even get that any pain there anymore, but we can still get a good stimulus from that movement. It's like, that's one example of like, okay, you've maintained the qualities of like that movement that you want, that you're going to need, without the other stuff that's coming along with it. It's obviously negative that you don't want.
Yeah.
So there's a number of ways that you could do that sort of thing depending on different movements. But I think if you get somebody who's super smart like Day, they know how to do that.
Or Ben.
Yeah, but again, I the one thing I feel like this is maybe a balancing act. It's like, I feel like sometimes coaches are like, we're not physical therapists, so we can't give any good recommendations. And I don't think that's true. However, there's also coaches who like don't want to outsource to physical therapists at all. And that's just like irresponsible and dangerous. So I think to the coaches listening, if you can be balanced with like how you go about that process, that's also like a good way to be, where it's like, I know what I'm capable of doing from a coach's perspective, especially if you're remote. Like I can't do an assessment on my athlete or like diagnose them, especially not through my phone. But to understand like there are certain things that I can do. Like I can manipulate movements where I can figure out if they're in pain or not. I can adjust volume and intensity to things to get to be appropriate. And then hopefully I can work in concert with a PT that I trust to really like help push the athlete forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's great. It's like as a coach, like stay in your lane and know that you're not a physical therapist, but also know that there are things that you can do to help.
Yeah. Because that's your job.
Yes, 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 it is.
Sweet. No, I think that's good. Again, if you got questions, reach out to Day.
Reach out to me.
Muñoz.
Yes, on IG or day@zorfitness.com.
Email. Sweet. If you got questions, let us know.
Sweet.
Thanks for listening today. If you're someone who just started listening to the show, I would encourage you to subscribe so you can stay up to date. If you're someone who's been listening for a while, I would encourage you to rate and review the show. And lastly, the best thing that you can do to support our work is also the best thing that you can do for your performance. And that is by hiring one of our coaches. Until next time, stay the course.